Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, your co-author and co-host, and with me, reporting in from a mausoleum, my co-author and co-host.
It's an ossuary, actually.
Oh.
Trent Hergenrader is here.
Future gravedigger. We are now at our...
Apropos for the conversation.
Apropos for the conversation. Mostly this epilogue is about our observations within academia and education and what we would suggest has to change in order for what we think to be good teaching, good learning, good assessment to stick. What would have to happen in order for that to be the case? So we're going to read off just those bullet points we included in the epilogue, listing the things we perceive or contend are issues. And then we're going to use that as a framework for deconstructing the core problem, which if you listen to the previous 14, 15 episodes, you will probably have some indication of, but may be surprised by. Probably not.
Probably not.
I'm not going to read the entire paragraphs. They are listed in the book, but just the bold-faced content. And then we're going to talk a little bit about all of these as they are interconnected.
Let me read the even ones.
Okay, we'll do it that way.
It's a
I'll do the odd ones, you do the even one.
Okay,
perfect. We're modeling. Okay, so number one.
We're modeling.
Number one, just like textbooks, film strips, computers, and tablets, games cannot replace quality educators.
True. Number two, investment should be made to train educators, not buy equipment or prepackaged curricula.
All right, number three, educators are overwhelmed and seldom have the administrative support necessary to implement new approaches.
That's true. Number four, many educators lack the interest or incentives to change how they teach.
Yeah, I want to come back to that one. I have some additional thoughts on it.
All right.
The next one we got here is good education is messy and grades get in the way. Certainly not anything we haven't mentioned already, right?
Right. And then finally, number six, good education requires ample time, space, and support, which I would hope would be inarguable. But there we go. Those are the 6 points.
Those are the 6 points. And actually, the next sentence after the sixth one says the arms race spurred by neoliberal policy, namely treating universities like businesses, has dramatically inflated tuition, but little of that money has gone toward improved on-campus physical and mental health care, accessibility services, offices of diversity and inclusion, new tenure-track faculty, additional paid assistantships for grad students, or foundational humanities programs. And I think that right there is a good summary of our main contention, our main argument that money... Capitalism is the reason why education is in such dire straits. So before I get on a rant, let me open it to you.
All right, let me rant first.
Let me constrain this a little bit so we don't just kind of
We're gonna need a timer. We're gonna need a timer for.
We'll have to do this
remarks.
like a formalized debate. You'll have to call in what the contention is, and then you have 5 minutes to say whatever.
We have the Oscar Awards music that it's like, it's playing in the background.
Playing you off. Let me constrain this a little bit by saying, like, from your purview, as somebody who has been doing world building for 15 years plus now, depending on how you want to count it.
Right.
What are the things you have seen change in your the educational component of your career that maybe early on seemed like they were okay, but have gradually deteriorated and have made it less and less possible to effectively scale up or implement some of the things we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so bigger context. I did my undergrad from 92 to 96, took about 10 years out working in different nonprofits and things like that. Went back to graduate school from 2006 to 2013, getting my master's and my PhD. And then I've been at one institution, private institution, STEM institution in the Northeast of the United States from 2013 till today. And I think this is one of the things that people often get so wrong about higher ed is that we're not all Harvard and Yale, for God's sakes. Like, anytime you watch on TV, it's always oak furniture and leather and, it's like, no, it's all plastic and linoleum, man. Like, I have to carry out my own garbage. And if I want my office vacuumed, I've got to do it, right? So, and that's not a joke. That's literally where we're at. So just speaking from my perspective, one of the things, too, that my particular institution is super concerned about is job placement. They do co-ops and then students get jobs. And what I have been seeing from my time from 2006, I would say up until today, is this increasing pressure on like having a degree that matches 1-to-1 for job ads. And then the dissatisfaction when that doesn't ever work right. And it's like, what are we like? That is what's driving most of this. is work preparedness. And we just keep doubling down and quadrupling down on this fundamentally stupid idea that it's like so I'm at a university with 22,000 students, right? How many different industries are those 22,000 students going to go to? How many different employers are those 22,000 students going to go to? And it just keeps going. How in the hell am I supposed to train them with specific job outcomes for every possible job? Like, it's just ridiculous. Like, if you just think about it on the face of it, it's stupid. We should just be thinking about how can we get people to critically think, empathize, and then have some sort of track record of projects and things that they've learned through products that they've created collaboratively and whatever. And then, crazy idea, let jobs do the job training. Let the hirers do the job training. Like, that's the way it used to work. That's the way it used to work, is that you would go to college, graduating from college, you would get your job, and then the job would train you. Right? And it's like,
well, so let me jump in for a quick second, because I have a thought about that specific piece, the job training piece, since for those of you who are unaware, I, in addition to doing instructional design, have managed various kinds of training, both in higher education and corporate industry environments. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from being in industry, being in a corporate training environment, is that the view, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, because I think depending on the organization, the training teams are distributed in different ways and have different amounts of influence over how this all works. But I would say generally, the training that you are given is very technical. It is meant to teach you, here, click on this, do this. It's not about critical thinking. Right, exactly. It's like, here's the process you need to follow, push these buttons in this order to get it to go the way we need it to, or get these claims taken care of, or whatever it is, right? Make your widgets, fill out your paperwork. So I think one of the things that gets conflated when people are talking about the role of higher ed or the role of school and job placement or worker training is that critical thinking is not inherently a part of job training. And yet the people who are hiring will complain that they want employees to be critical thinkers, but the training isn't designed for that. And the assumption is all that critical thinking stuff is going to happen in high school and college or graduate school, depending on the level of the job you're talking about. So the expectation is that all these people are going to graduate from college, go into those roles, know how to critically think, and all we have to do is teach them which buttons to push in what order to do the specific task we're hiring them to do. But what's happened as a result of the quantification of education, the businessification of education, is that it has tilted toward efficiency and quantitative outcomes. And as a result, there isn't much of that critical thinking training happening at all. And so now you have this misalignment of objectives in the classes that are being taught in college with the job placement to what they actually want people to be able to do, which is to see a problem, work backward to the root cause, and then be able to adjust that, which does require critical thinking. So you have this entire system that has been structured in such a way that nobody gets what they want out of it. And yet we're kind of still doing it. There's a really, really good video it was based on a TED Talk, I believe, by Ken Robinson. And it was specifically Ken Robinson, the British author, educationalist. And it's all about creativity, right? He did this whole TED Talk or whole speech about creativity. And it was just called Do Schools Kill Creativity? And the entire argument he makes is that the modern conception of what education is, that you have an assembly line that was built for an industrial era, it worked to what it needed to do at that time, but it's just woefully unprepared, woefully inefficient, woefully inadequate for the actual problems we face in the 21st century. And so and
they didn't have learning science.
Right, they didn't have learning science.
We didn't even understand how people learn. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to round off that thought, like his argument ends up being that if you ask kindergartners what you can do with a paperclip, they can come up with like 500 different things you could do with it. They're very quote unquote creative. And if you ask an adult this, somebody who's gone through the entire K-12 education system, they have a much harder time coming up with creative applications of a paperclip because they have been trained by this industrial model of education to think more unilaterally about a lot of this stuff. And again, we've complained about how all the subject areas are siloed, how they don't really interact sufficiently with one another, that we don't do enough problem-based education. And again, this does not mean that no teachers do this or that no schools do this, right? Like these things do happen, but they are not the norm. And I think that's kind of our argument here, going back to what you were saying about not all higher education is Harvard. Like that's true in a bunch of different ways.
Right.
And I would even say that probably the best places or the places you're most likely to see innovation are probably community colleges, because
Yeah.
the risk benefit calculation is a lot different versus at a Research One university, or an Ivy League school, or some other kind of private institution. And this is one of those reasons why we've tried to spread the word about world building, is because we want people to seed this stuff in and see if they can do it from the ground up at a grassroots level, because it's never going to come from the top. It's just not. It doesn't work that way.
It's funny too, because like as you're talking, and this is something too that depending on where listeners are and their own political beliefs or whatever, like in terms of the United States, I am like on the radical crazy left, where everywhere else is just sort of like generally left of center, right? Where it's like people should generally care about each other, right? We should have systems that work. And like even with capitalism, I am not so like capitalism is great if you're making phones and you want people to compete, right? And the best product is going to win out and all that kind of stuff. But there are absolutely industries and things that you should partition off and say, this will not work this way. There is no short-term benefit. There is no, you know what I mean? Like if you're going to cut corners, if you're going to externalize, you're going to end up hurting people. Healthcare, transportation, environmental damage, right? You know, like education. I always say capitalism is a system that produces winners and losers. We celebrate the winners and completely forget about the losers. So if you've got 20 people who go to a doctor for the day, and the doctor is running in a capitalistic fashion, what happens to the patients that lose, right? Like, why? Like, it's a stupid framework to put on something that isn't about that. It's about health. It's about care. It's about society. It's about making sure that people are, you know, and it's the same thing. I was laughing. We were talking today earlier online about this store called Ollie's, right? And Ollie's, it's a discount superstore.
It's Ollie's Discount Bargain Outlet. So if you've never been to a place like Ocean State Job Lot or Ollie's, whatever, you can kind of imagine it being like Goodwill, except it's not stuff people have donated. It's just stuff that fell off a truck somewhere.
Right,
or more likely, it's for like companies go out of business or whatever. They're liquidating stock. They need to clear out their warehouses or whatever. They send it to a bargain outlet because they can sell it for something and you know not lose as much money. I was saying this earlier. Like when I go in there, I think the thing that is most interesting about it is the unhinged, deranged signage that is infringing on every copyright you can imagine, but it's all done in this way that I think you could feasibly say it's parody. Like it's very weird. So anyway, it's a discount store.
So our friend, our common friend, has a partner who hates Ollie's. She hates Ollie's. I'm like, okay, why? I've never been, and now I'm like excited to go when I started hearing about it. And his reply was the chaos, the randomness, wading through the shit to find something decent. And I replied, you're listing the positives. What doesn't she like about it, right? And this is where both Steve and I were, you know, sort of laughing about this, because that's exactly, I mean, like, and I said, you know, this is my pedagogical approach to teaching fiction writing, right? Where it's like, it is intentionally, it's one of those things where it's like, oh, it's not really easily to be measured, you know, like this, you know, all these kind of games and world building and, you know, whatever. Like, how do you measure that? What are the metrics, whatever? And it's like, those are questions for capitalists to answer. Those questions have no space in my classroom. Thank you very much. Right. And then it's like, oh, well, how do we know that you're not doing nothing? And I'm like, well, if that is actually the concern, then let's sit down and develop some sort of criteria by which I can tell you and show you and prove to you that students at the beginning to the end of the semester have come out learning something. But it's not going to be a standardized test. It's not going to be super efficient, right? Like, so work with me here, because I know what I'm talking about. And you don't when it comes to education, right? When you've got business people, when you've got politicians, when you've got all of these people making decisions about education who know next to nothing about actual education. And it's like, well, look, you can just kind of keep driving into this stuff harder and harder and harder. And then you're going to get madder and madder and madder that we're not getting anywhere, because you've come up with a solution that is not an answer to the actual problem. And you refuse to listen to the people who are telling you what the actual problems are, because they're too expensive and inconvenient to fix. And it's like, then don't blame me, right? That it's not, don't blame me that students are coming out and not being prepared for whatever job that you happen to be at. That seems like a you problem. That doesn't seem like a me problem. But anyway, it's like, I don't mean to be super confrontational, but I get pissed because it's like, look, we're doing a great job. And in terms of like what it is to learn, going back to sort of Socratic method and why is the university even around, all these kinds of questions, is like, we're more with the history of all of that than this tiny tail end that is basically facing all of these problems because of neoliberalism. And if you don't believe me, then why isn't tuition in Europe gone up 70, 100,000% like it has in the United States, because they are not engaging in the educational arms race. See, this is where I start getting pissed off. They are not, I guess in the UK they are. In the UK they are. But in other parts of Europe, they are not saying every student gets to live in a high-rise dorm with flat screens and high-speed internet and a lazy river and 50 different options in the food court. That's what's making the cost of college going up. It's not the cost of instruction. And it sure as shit ain't professor salaries, right? So again, it's one of those things where it's like, powers that be have built these like micro cities that have everything, and it's like, it's basically all about how can we get enough cash out of these students while they're here, as opposed to how can we fully train these people into being good citizens and, critical thinkers and empathetic? Because again, going back to what we said last time, teaching people to be critical thinkers and empathetic and whatever doesn't make as much money as having a really good food court.
Well, and I think that just to go back to something we had talked about previously too, that I had a debate with a friend of mine, a former colleague, about the rate of indirect costs, or the indirects that come with grants. And so for those of you who aren't in higher ed, when you get a grant, some percentage of that grant is taken by the institution you work for to cover things that are ostensibly about infrastructure. So
40 to 45%, I think generally is
I would say that's even low. Like I've seen numbers between 50 is not uncommon. I have seen as high as 60 or 65. And keep in mind, like if you're getting a grant for $100,000, that means $65,000 of the grant is going just to the university, which means that you as the researcher have $35,000 to work with, not $100,000, right?
Correct.
So think of it kind of like taxes, and you're paying them into the university system ostensibly for the support services provided by the system that were necessary in order for you to be housed and do this research. I don't mean housed like in a house. I mean housed at an institution to do the research.
With the equipment, with the facilities.
Right, exactly. So if you're doing research that involves electron microscopes or very powerful, some sort of reactor or autoclaves, whatever, all that equipment and stuff that's put into the university system, that's helping to pay for it. But the contention was that, oh no, all of that money is actually being taken and spent on DEI and spent on training, workplace harassment training or whatever. It's like, well, no, that's not what's happening.
It's not at all what's happening.
I think when we're talking about a lot of these issues, they are systemic. It's not like there's one person in the wrong job and therefore the whole thing's falling apart. There are too many administrators. There are too many administrators who do stuff that doesn't really seem to have value for a system designed for education. Like they just kind of exist for other purposes. That stuff costs a lot of money. But the real issue underlying all of that is it's twofold. Partly it's the education arms race of universities competing for tuition dollars, right? But that itself was motivated because we just sort of collectively as a society stopped thinking that education was good to pay for as a public good.
As a public good,
so you see states or the federal government withdrawing the amount of support that they're giving to universities, and universities have to make up that difference somewhere. So that money has to come from tuition dollars, or it has to come from grant indirects, and it comes from cutting faculty. It comes from making class sizes larger. It means like there are all of these different incentives that are driving behavior that move further and further away from what academia or higher education was or should be, I think, in an idealized world, and more toward this commodification where really what you are, we complained about this previously, but you're not paying for the education or the learning, you're paying for the diploma to credential you to get the job. And even that part doesn't really work anymore. So we have all of these other parts of this pipeline that are broken down and corroded. And I think my question at the end of all of this is just, what do we do with the system we have? Like, is there a way we can even remotely fix any of this as it's constituted? And the second part of that question being, in our mind, what would a high quality education system in some future society look like? And maybe this will be good to talk to Brian Alexander about, since he's a futurist. He thinks about higher education. He's written, I actually have a book on my shelf somewhere. Academia Next was one of his books. I'm eager to talk to him about this because I'm sure he'll have a lot of thoughts. But from your perspective, like, what do you think would be necessary to get us to some sort of idealized state of higher ed? And how do we and what we're doing, how does that fit into any of it?
Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, why would you ask me that question? I have no idea. It's one of those things where it's like the thing that I feel we're on the track for is for the closure for an enormous number of universities. The universities are always going to be in demand. Higher education is always going to be in demand. The question is, what is going to be their purpose? And it's going to largely, in my apocalyptic vision, it's going to be institutions for rich kids and professor's speech is going to be very, very heavily policed. Right.
Mhm.
So it's going to continue to be sort of not critical thinking. It is going to be indoctrination of capitalism, Christianity, whatever it is that we want to indoctrinate people with to support corporate America is my sort of like bleak vision of where I think we're actually going to go. One of the things too that I've talked about with other educators who I always, when I'm talking with people and you start to think, okay, well, this, we're kind of grooving now, whatever. This idea too that we've got these massive institutions that are, or maybe not even massive, like there's lots of little liberal arts colleges and things like that, but it's the old town and gown thing, right? Where it's like,
Mhm.
here in Rochester, we've got RIT, we've got University of Rochester, Nazareth, St. John Fisher, whatever, and they're pretty closed off from each other and from the public at large. So like, what I would imagine a perfect sort of higher ed being would be a massive sort of influx of public funds and then a massive payout of public good, right? So it's like in
Mhm.
terms of giving lots of, but this is the thing, is that what the culture even wants? Like that's what I want the culture to want, but I don't know if that's what the
Yeah.
culture actually wants. And this was part of the air in Madison when I lived in Madison, Wisconsin. There was less of that because and I was an alumni, but you'd get things. There's a talk on campus. Come, hear these two
Mhm.
people debate. All that kind of stuff. And I wish that universities were more encouraged to
Mhm.
invite members of we'll call them the lifelong learning community
Mhm.
come in and kind of like continue to think about how things work, continue to think about how the world has changed from the time when you graduated, and whatever. Because a literature class today looks very different than a literature class did even 20 years ago, right? And then 20 years back and 20 years back. So if you've got somebody who graduated from, university in the 1980s and they're a retiree, it's sort of I know in the Wisconsin system, if you're a retiree, I think you can audit any class for free. And there should be, in my vision of like a perfect world, there should be 10 times more of that. There should be 10 times more encouragement that you don't need to have gotten a degree from here or from anywhere to come in and listen to these things and listen to smart people debate topics that they know a lot
Mhm.
about, right? As opposed to sitting at home eating processed food, binge watching Desperate Housewives of Atlanta or whatever the hell those show, this schlocky, stuff that doesn't give anything back and cuts people off from each other. So everybody is in their
Mhm.
own house doing their own thing and there is no communal. I mean, that's where universities, in my mind, should be almost like a public library, what they used to be at least, a place where people can congregate and gather and exchange ideas and have and all these other kind of things. But the other part of this is that it's the same thing for me when people are complaining about how K through 12 teachers are not solving like literally every problem that an urban city has or like an urban area
Mhm.
has, right? It's like, oh, well, the kids are coming in, malnutrition, the parents have never read to them before, they've got an uncle who is selling them drugs or whatever. Now the teacher has to teach them Shakespeare. Right? It's like, okay, that teacher is not responsible for anything outside of their classroom. And it just so happens that the entire life of the student is coming with them into that classroom,
Mhm.
right? But all of this stuff, it's more or less what I was saying, the bleak vision that I think we're going to be at. It's like the absolute opposite of that, completely open, completely for all ages, right? Because this is one of the things too that I've said before, I think in one of the earlier episodes, I hardly ever have non-traditional students. I mean, hardly ever, I don't think I've ever had one who has been beyond maybe 25 years old, right? So even
Mhm.
those students. And it was so great at UW Milwaukee to have so many non-traditional students to be able to call BS, like once you get out into once you get out into your
Mhm.
career, things won't work like this, whatever. It's invaluable to have that kind of life experience in the classroom. And the way that we've got things set up, that's going to diminish, right? Like everything is going to be diminished. So it's not just that we're on a train ride to hell or whatever here. It's like, well, this is being, just like we talked about in the last one, I feel in my heart of hearts, this is being engineered this way to make sure that that doesn't happen, to keep more people ignorant, hooked on stupid things, not being able to have any media literacy or any kind of critical thinking whatsoever. That's what those people in power want. And it may sound very crazy conspiracy theory or whatever, but I'm just telling you, like looking at this goes back to something else that I'd said, is that the people in charge right now who I think are engineering this stuff are not stupid people. They are well read and they are quite bright and they are trying to shape a future that benefits them and no one else. Right. So
Mhm.
it's not that these things are capricious and they don't know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. And that future that I described, where it's wealthy, predominantly white students of traditional college age getting a higher education to then go manage Fortune 500 companies, I think that's their dream. And my dream is pretty much the exact opposite. So,
I think as you were talking, I kept thinking, like, universities did serve that kind of purpose in some ways forever. I mean, I think into antiquity, you could kind of make the argument that the earliest schools really did kind of serve that cultural purpose of being an epicenter for everybody to be able to have those conversations of debate. Certainly in ancient Greece, like that's the model we kind of point to. But I think a lot of that has become distributed and universities are no longer the gatekeepers to it.
right.
So I think about that a lot. Like you and I frequently will talk about the education ecosystem and the information ecosystem and where those things overlap or don't, and how they interact with politics, how they interact with socioculture. And I do wonder all the time, like, what about the utility brought by having Complexly, which creates all the crash course videos that are on YouTube, Hank and
Right.
John Green, right? They're an example of a pair of people and obviously an institution they have helped create that exists to supplement this other stuff we're arguing should be happening in higher ed but doesn't, or to be more egalitarian, to democratize that information to more people. Because I go back to all the time, like when I was a kid and I wanted to know something about a fish, or I really wanted to learn about highlight or whatever random thing caught my attention that day, I would go to the library. And if there was no card in the card catalog or there was no book that had anything about it, that was it. Like there was nowhere for me to learn about it, right? And certainly wasn't going to get that in K-12 school because there was a curriculum and my teachers didn't necessarily have that content, right? So I think all the time about how the openness or the decentralization of information has made it possible for anyone anywhere to learn stuff. But to go back to something you and I have talked about before, that depends on people wanting to learn it. And I think that's the piece I missed. Like when I went into graduate school and I wanted to study educational technology and understand how people's cognition interacted with tech, I made the assumption that people would engage with this stuff because as soon as it was available to them, they would be drawn to it the same way I was. And I was really wrong about that.
Yeah, exactly.
So now I think about, all of these failings of higher ed, or all of these things that K-12 isn't doing, or all of these things that corporate training can't accomplish. And I don't think I would say I believe it's all just been a failure. I think it's that there are now all of these different communities that exist that do these things, but they're not overlapping anymore. And there is no one cultural moment we all share anymore. It's just atomized and individualized. And that is partly by design. I think it's partly by just being a downstream effect of the capitalist system we exist in and what's happened in the post-World War II era. But I don't know that you can get out of this in a way that goes back to having that shared cultural or community space unless or until you fundamentally change the other structures and institutions that interact with education. Like this is a thought experiment we used to do with the ed tech students I taught, the graduate students, was if you could go back to square one and build schools from nothing, what would they look like?
Right.
And the problem always ended up being that and this was in the case of the role-playing activity I had created for these students as part of my dissertation research. But we would ask them, like, well, where would you start? What would you do? And it always went back to, well, what is the government like? Or what is the economics of this place? Or how are they making money? What does trade look like? And so, and that was all before the world building stuff became part of my regular research, my scholarship. But it's one of those things that made me think, like, to have that even basic conversation about what should school look like, you really do have to be able to wrap your head around all these other systems and be able to question, like, where can you push on those systems to make that change happen? Or does it entirely have to happen organically from the bottom up because the institutions themselves are so calcified that there's no way to actually fix them without tearing them apart?
Right. And I think too, I'd be very quick to add here, academics drive me crazy too, right? Like it's not like academics are innocent of one of the stereotypes is the academic who just retreats down their little cubby hole and doesn't, they're really, really interested in what the cloves in the wardrobe in Ulysses. What does that represent, right? Well, no one else in the world really cares. But if that's like the only, unless you're a Joyce scholar, but like that's the only thing they care about. And then if students don't care about it, then it's a deficiency of the students, right? And it's like, okay, or talking in language that other people don't understand, using jargon that is, and this is where too, if I am talking to other people, and this happens all the time. It's happened to both of us in games and learning. You can calibrate within a few sentences whether somebody is up to speed on how all of this stuff works or not, right? And anybody, like we were laughing because I was saying this before when I've had students who come see me present and they're like, I didn't know you could act like a professional, right? And it's like, oh, well, yeah, because that's the role I'm playing. When I'm at a podium in front of a room full of my peers, I'm going to use the language that they understand that will explain. So if I were to talk about game-based learning, I would want to bring in learning theory. I would want to bring in all of the, theoretical concepts, constructionism and whatever. If I was explaining that to undergrads, I would use different language, right? Like I would use different language to get the same points across. And it would be the same thing. Like, why do we have more academics that are supposed to be or who should be publicly facing intellectuals, not demeaning people for not understanding, but inviting them into the conversation, right? And giving, because I mean, like, in terms of just our current global issues that are looming large, there's plenty of room for people to do public lectures, to do debates, to like get the bigger, paint a wider canvas. And universities do, I think, do this quite a bit. But how many people from the random public are invited into those conversations to better their own understanding of the world? And I would go out on a limb, and I don't have numbers for this, but I would say not very often. It's for the university community, not for the broader community at large.
That's what I was going to say, is that actually every educational community I've worked in has been a public institution. And I took my commitment to public scholarship super seriously, to the point where I viewed my job as a professor, as a faculty member, as a researcher, to communicate to a public that is not part of the insular ivory tower, right? Like, this is one of those things that really frustrated me from within higher ed, is that you only get rewarded or benefited by giving presentations or writing articles for other people who exist in higher ed. You don't get rewarded for publicly talking about your research, explaining to the public what it has to do with their lives, how it might be influential in all these different directions. So if I get to go on NPR and talk about my research, or I publish in a magazine that's aimed at teenagers or whatever, like Teen Vogue or something, that doesn't quote unquote count, right? The only thing that counts is if I write a peer-reviewed article for a journal like Review of Ed Research or some other reputable academic journal. And if you don't do that enough, you get in trouble, because that's not what you're supposed to be doing. You should be. So the projects that I was working on when I was administrating the ed tech program were almost universally aimed at trying to communicate this stuff to the public about games and education, about trying to create written documentation, video documentation, social media content like TikToks and posts on social media or whatever. That was what I was really interested in doing, because that was much more important for mobilizing around these ideas than me publishing in another academic journal. Those people don't need to hear this, right? Like, if you reach a certain level, and you and I have talked about this with respect to academic conferences, that after you finish grad school, they stop being useful, like, for the most part. Like, they are good for networking. They're good for finding other people who are interested in similar topics. They're really, really bad, generally, for furthering the conversation about the things we're actually trying to research, because everyone is there for self-aggrandizing purposes related to the incentive structures of higher ed.
Right.
It's not about, again, I'm painting with a really broad brush, because I think some very small conferences are great, but large conferences with lots of people from across the entire field are way less useful. They are it's self-masturbatory circle jerk, for lack of a better phrase. Like, it's a bunch of people who know the jargon, who are able to get together and talk about this stuff, that exclude everyone in the public who would actually benefit from hearing this. And like, my dream for this book was to write something that would be accessible to a broad audience, that would not be written for academics who, academics could pull from it the same ideas as a guy who's 20 years old in college learning about education because he thinks he might want to be a teacher and he likes Fortnite. Maybe he can think about how to use world building in his classroom in the future, right? Like, that to me was much more important than the let's publish a book that'll be read by no one and then sit in a library shelf never being used, but I could claim on my CV and would get me a promotion within academia. So,
well, that's what I mean. Like, it's funny too, because you write your monograph and it's on your when you write a dissertation, a lot of people will then take their dissertation and either revise for publication or take parts of it and expand for publication or whatever. And I remember talking with a colleague who was looking at some of the sales numbers for some of these books, and they're in the hundreds, like the low hundreds. 200 people bought and read this person's dissertation, and it's like 200 people like that. I had lectures bigger than that, right? So if you're thinking about making an impact, like, give me a break, right? But I just think too, there's as things have evolved, and I think this is true for society and our institutions writ large as well, is that technology has sped up a combination of technology
that's a big part of
and
it too.
capitalist pressure has sped up daily life, right? To the point at which we are measuring our seconds. And, some of these things, like when we were just talking about quality educators, training educators, buy equipment, not curricula, looking back through, we don't have the necessary support. Some of these things take time, in which you just kind of get together, brainstorm, whatever. And it's like, there's a lot of unstructured time in corporate spaces as well for this kind of, what's the next R&D, like all these kind of things.
Right.
But what's happening in higher ed all over the place is they're cutting staff positions and they're putting the faculty, the professors, in charge of doing staff positions. And I just said I was going to invite somebody to campus last semester. And this is like, again, people who aren't in higher ed don't appreciate this, right? So I'm an associate professor teaching, my 3 classes or whatever it is, and doing, my writing, got this book coming out. I've got 2 articles, right? So there's a lot of stuff on my plate. In order for me to have this speaker who happened to be passing through upstate New York, I'm like, oh, maybe I should have her come in and give this talk. I personally would need to find the room, book concessions, help pay for their travel, right? All of these administrative tasks that do not require a PhD in English, right? And it's like, but you don't want to hire somebody to do those tasks because you've got me, right? And it's like, okay, but you could hire a high school student to do all of those things, right? Like there are a variety of things. And it's not that I'm too good to do it. It's that I don't have the time to do it all, right? And it's the same thing with, this is what I kept thinking about K through 12 and games and education, and why the prepackaged, like we're just going to sell this to the entire district and teachers are going to have it dropped into their lap. Well, that's why they want it to be a turnkey, to use another corporate barfy phrase. They want it to be turnkey because the teachers don't have time to be trained up on anything new. And then it's like, oh, but then we're only a step away from removing teachers entirely, as opposed to, like, this is the whole thing with our professors writing questions with AI, that students are writing questions, writing their answers with AI. And it's like, that's a pretty stupid system. So we need to rethink what it is we're even doing here, right? And that's what I would sort of suggest too with all education, K through 12, which we won't do. But that's really what needs to happen, is go back and say, hey, look, we've had these institutions that have grown, they've changed. They've adapted. We've got different populations, than all these kind of questions. So let's just kind of take a pause and then think about how this could be restructured, right? The problem is, of course, I'm not naive. There are vested interests all over the place. Money talks, right? There are going to be people who could see opportunities to make money, see opportunities to lose money with any of these changes. And basically you hit gridlock almost immediately, right? So that's in the background. That's also kind of what I'm thinking is I don't want to be a curmudgeon and be like, oh, it's impossible to change, but it's really hard to see given all of the constraints. It's like, I understand perfectly why we've reached this position, or not maybe perfectly. I've got a pretty good sense of how, higher education in the United States wound up where we are now through decisions that were made, largely in the late 20th and early 21st century. It doesn't have to do with its medieval roots. It has to do with Reaganomics, more or less, right? How would you redo it? Well, start from scratch. I don't know. You know what I mean? And like, how do you do that? Start a new school, K through 12. So, so all of those things, are really difficult to kind of get your head around. And that's where, as we've said before, the silver lining or whatever it is, I don't know, silver lining is the wrong thing, but it's like, okay, well, either I can choose to bang my head against the wall, or I can choose to continue to do things that I know that don't work, but at least I have it prepped already. Or I can use all of this experience and all of my knowledge in order to actually try and build a genuine, meaningful learning experience for all the students who come through my door. And that's what I'm choosing to do right now, right? It's like, that's the choice that I'm making. It's not going to change the world, I don't think, because you just start thinking about the number of people who don't go to college, who don't go to any university, number one, don't go to my university, number two, don't take my classes, number three, right? Like my actual personal impact is relatively small. But what I can do is try and affect the lives and the thoughts and the minds and the critical thinking of like literally the 32 people in front of me. You know what I mean? And it's like, I get a lot out of that. And that's why I continue to do it and don't go on. And it's not like there's great opportunities, but I knew a guy who was working as a waiter at Cheesecake Factory who made about twice as much as I did. So the point of that, and I don't begrudge that guy, when he makes it all, but the thing is, I'm not in this for the money. I don't think most professors are in this for the money. And it's getting to the point, and this is the part that I think actually really drives me the most crazy. It's getting to the point, there's a whole genre of quit lit is what it was called. I don't know if you remember this, 2013, 2014, 2015. people who were sort of like ostentatiously leaving academia because they no longer, thought the conditions were worthwhile, for their employment or whatever. And I think it's probably harder to get a job now than it was, 2013 or whatever. But still, point being is that I feel like we are going to be driving towards a situation like when I start thinking about the next 10 years, I'm not thinking about what is the way that I can perfectly, realign, everything to have a ideal, how can I help create an ideal learning outcome? The question that I'm wondering is, at what point will the things they're asking me to do tip over to the intolerable where it's no longer worth doing it for this salary? And I mean, I know lots of people who are in the same situation where it's like, hey, look, you double my class sizes, you make me teach more, you take away my research funds, and you pile on the service, the service work, the administrative work for this salary? I don't think so. You know what I mean? Where it's like, it's just not worth, because in order to do it well, we were talking about this too with our friend Kevin Balestrini about K through 12, where it's like, in his teaching, we had this sort of same thing where it's like, do the best you can. And it's like, at a certain point, you're like, I either have to work 120 hours a week to do the job that needs to be done, or I got to start cutting corners, which is the case for everybody, right? This is always the case with education. You could always do more. And then it's like, okay, but at what point are the returns diminished where it's like, what is even the point of this anymore, right? And I feel, and I'm actually genuinely worried that is creeping up faster than how can we like improve education. We're racing towards collapse is my apocalyptic sort of outlook.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of reasons to be bitter about a lot of this personally. As somebody who, unceremoniously lost a job in higher ed because of a lot of what we're describing, like that it was just a money issue. And, I did not have tenure. The position that I had had as faculty was non-tenured assistant professor in residence. And I was in that job for 6 years. And the whole reason they ended up eliminating that particular position was because it wasn't tenured. There was an opportunity to not have to grant a multi-year contract, which would keep them on the hook for more money. It would show up in the budget. So none of this had anything to do with the quality of work, the quantity of work. It was just entirely dollars and cents on a spreadsheet. And I think that being the fulcrum for our decision making about what should or shouldn't be happening, what is or isn't happening in higher education or in K-12 education, in all of these kinds of training environments, is just, it is destructive in a way that's hard to characterize in any one moment, but over time has a lot of consequences. And to your point, there's never been a time where I think there were enough educators for the number of students that needed to be taught. Like we've never been at a point where I think we could say the system was comfortable, right? Like I think there's always been a need for more educators, for more staff, for all of these things, and resources are ultimately limited. But we also weren't trying to aim for maximum efficiency at all times under all circumstances, right? Exactly. Like and I'm not advocating for waste. Like I think there's a lot of waste even now in this whole efficient system, quote unquote, but there needs to be some acknowledgement that if you want, and this goes back to what we said at the very beginning of this podcast, that if you want education to be about self-actualization, or you want it to be about democratization and getting people to know enough to be good citizens, like there is a bare minimum that you have to maintain in order for those things to even be possible. And it is not going to be possible by shoveling all of that responsibility onto individual instructors, that you are now your own administrative assistant and the janitor, and you're trying to do therapy for your students because they have no other outlet for this stuff. Like it reminds me of that now sort of cliche image of the teacher walking down the street wearing like many bowler hats, and each one is labeled with a different thing that's their responsibility, right? And we just shovel more and more and more onto all kinds of educators. Even, and I don't want anyone to think that this is strictly about K-12 or higher ed. Like this is true in corporate training as well, that the things that you are being asked to do fundamentally boil down to more with less. We want you to teach more people. We want you to get it done faster. We want you to be able to meet this number of expectations this quickly in order for us to be able to claim at the end of the quarter that we're more efficient than we were last quarter. And like, there is diminishing returns on all of it. You cannot get to a point where you can do all of these things infinitely into the future. Like this is the problem with capitalism. It's the problem with efficiency, is like you can only grind the thing so much before it just is dust. And I think that's kind of the situation we're talking about, as where in the epilogue, we describe ourselves as two cantankerous old Muppets yelling at things we can't control. And I feel like that's just the theme of this episode of the podcast too.
Yeah,
Like these
yeah,
are things that we know are problems, that we societally seem to know are problems,
right.
but that the cost of fixing them, much in the like is the case with climate change, is too much to bear beforehand. So we'd rather just deal with it after the
And
fact when it's
pretend.
even
Yep,
more expensive
exactly,
and difficult to
exactly.
fix.
And that's, I mean, another part of this too that really rubs me the wrong way or burns me is the way that we come up with what are the failings of higher ed, what are the solutions to those failings, right? All those kind of things.
Mhm.
And the people who are making those claims have no good basis on which they are making those claims, right?
Mhm.
And it's one of those things that, are you a college grad? Yes. Are you a college grad? Yes. Well, you went to Ohio State with 60,000 students, and you went to Anna Schmerling College in the hills of Vermont with a student population of 300 or whatever, where you had
Mhm.
dinner at the professors' houses. That's both higher ed and also completely different from each other. You know what I mean? And it's like,
Mhm.
so what are we talking about when we're talking about these kinds of problems? And it's like it's all of the, and I mean, again, I would argue without putting my tinfoil hat on that this is all engineered, right? If you ask a bunch of people what it means to support DEI, if you ask 10 people, you will get 10 different answers because there
Mhm.
is no, or what is woke, or what is any of these things, right? Like there are no definitions that stick, and that's intentional because then they can get splattered on absolutely everything, right? And it's like
Mhm.
all you got to say is college is too expensive, which I would agree with, and students are coming out unprepared. And then the question is, unprepared for what exactly? Like what is it that they're
Mhm.
supposed to be prepared for? Give me specifics. And I often feel like it's, oh, well, they're complaining that women don't get the same treatment as men when they should really just be shutting up and writing the memo I told them to write. And it's like, that is not a failure of higher ed, right? You know what I mean? That is a failure of our culture to not address these problems that are within our institutions, right? And
Mhm.
it's like, and then it's like, oh, but that's not going to bring in the money and blah blah blah. And believe me, it's one of those things that I understand. There are give and takes, and there are pushes and pulls to all this kind of stuff. And I just think sort of the baseline culture that you are born and raised and brought up in seems to be the thing that you're going to think that's the way it always is, that's the way it's always been, blah blah blah, right? And we're just going to have to get on with it. And having spent a good amount of time in Europe, especially in Portugal and Spain, talking to different people, it's like it's part of their baked in European culture, Nordic, I think all throughout Europe, that you just have a strong social safety net. Everybody
Mhm.
pays in a lot, and it's better for everybody because overall we've got more stuff that everybody benefits from. And in the United States, it's the totally individualistic thing, right? In which you are unique, you are special, you are destined for great things. And in that kind of competition, it's like there is not as much room for social good, right? Because you're surrounded by competitors at all times, right? If that's the world that you're born into and raised into, then it seems that it's so entrenched that it can't change. Maybe it shouldn't even have to change because it's just not working, right? And it's like, okay, but when it comes to people who ask me, oh, you're a college professor, well, what do you think about college costs? I'm like, oh, it's extraordinarily way too much. You know what I mean? Like tuition is ridiculous. I can't imagine, you know what I mean, having to spend $200,000 to get your bachelor's degree. That's getting off cheap at this point. But when I went, most people were able to pay down their debt within a year or two or whatever. And it's like a completely different kind of set of conditions. So you can't look at the conditions today and say, well, when I was a kid, I got a part-time job and paid for my college. Because unless your part-time job is, working at Goldman Sachs making, $90,000 a year or whatever, you're never going to be able to pay because the tuition's gone up too fast, right? But we don't talk about, like when we have these conversations and I say we don't talk about this stuff, it's like this stupid shit that flies around on Twitter and social media where no one's really thinking deeply, asking questions. There's nobody's job is to answer them or to fact check or whatever. So it's just lots and lots and lots of knee-jerk shit coming out of people who don't know what they're talking about, that then bots throw fuel on the fire and drive everyone crazy. I mean, it's not, this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is like actually the history of the internet from the last 25 years, right? Now we are, like you said, I feel like this game has been played. This is the late stage capitalism thing. The game has been played. 2-minute warning in the fourth quarter. How much more can get done under this system before the whole thing just collapses? So
There
I
are
don't, I mean,
two things that come to mind as you were talking. First was I don't know if listeners will know this. I think probably you will, as people who are either familiar with games and playful learning or world building, or at least the vague outline of education and gaming. But the original version of Monopoly was called the Landlord's Game, and there were actually two versions of it. It was supposed to be educational, and it was meant to inform people about the benefits and drawbacks of different kinds of systems, socialism or capitalism. And the only version that's still sold and played now, the one that for which there are a billion different editions, is Monopoly, the version that was meant to be an example of what goes wrong in a system that goes essentially out of control only in favor of individualistic attempts to outplay the people around you, to
Yep.
get money from them and pay as little as possible. And I should specify too that the creator of the Landlord's Game, Elizabeth Magee, was really interested in Georgism and using this to educate what a pro-social environment could or should look like. And if you played that other version of the Landlord's Game, the version that was oriented towards pro-social outcomes, you quickly realized, oh, actually, the best system is the one in which we all collaborate. And maybe there's no one runaway leader who makes all of the money, but we all end up in a better place overall financially than we would have in the other system. And so I think we have doubled down in higher ed, in education, in business, in culture on the monopoly version of the Landlord's Game and not the other, because some small number of people realized if I break the rules in these ways, I can be the runaway leader. And then whatever happens to everybody else is whatever. It's not my problem, not my circus, not my monkey, right? Like
even more close to today than the Landlords. Because when was that? That was late 19th, early 20th century. Do you know?
The board game Monopoly was in 1935, but the Landlord's Game was published in 1904, patented in 1904.
Right.
So it was, right at the turn of the century, and all of this was fresh out of the Industrial Revolution. So anyway, I bring that up just because it feels strangely relevant to this conversation.
Right. As you were talking, I was going to say more close to our contemporary moment is Squid Game, right? Like they make Squid Game as an overt critique of capitalism, right? Like that is, and then what they do, they fucking franchise it, right? It's like you could, like, if I wrote a story where that happened, it would get rejected because it's too ridiculous to be true. No culture would be that bankrupt, whatever.
Right.
Like, no, we're doing it. We're doing it with smiles on our faces. So
the other thing I was going to say, though, and I think this is a fair critique, and it's one that I think, again, if we could kind of like scratch out the system that exists and rebuild around it to do something different, it would look more like a German model of education where there is academia, there is higher education, there are ways in which that public scholarship serves the greater good, but not everybody is encouraged or ushered into it. And I think that's one of the failings of our particular system is that we basically created a situation where we said, if you want to get ahead in your career, you need this diploma. And if you have that diploma, it's going to indicate to these businesses that you know what you're talking about, you're a critical thinker, whatever. But then we devalued it by changing what higher education was and turning schools into diploma mills. Not all of them. They don't all exist that way. Like you said, I think there's a bunch of universities that do really great things, or small colleges or whatever, community colleges for sure. But if you have all these diploma mills giving everybody an undergraduate degree, then what does the degree really represent? Do you have this influx of people who, even if the system was great for everybody, you have all of these people graduating with degrees? Well, then that changes the baseline employee, because now you have all of these people expecting their salaries to be commensurate with their level of education. And that's not possible because there are only so many spots for people to get paid that amount of money, right? So like, this is why I think, especially as we've had this transition away from the trades to higher ed specifically, college education specifically, there is a need to kind of think about what are we creating as alternative mechanisms of credentialing for different kinds of roles. And this is kind of what we've talked about previously with respect to world building. That doesn't preclude those places from focusing on similar kinds of ideas, right? Like you can teach critical thinking and empathy in a trade school too. It's just that the kinds of content you're teaching would probably be different. And I think that's what we have to be okay with, this idea that we shouldn't be biasing ourselves toward a liberal arts college education away from trade school. I think it's more of we should be thinking, how do we prepare learners to consider which path they might want to be on, and sort of destigmatize the trades. The trades have been treated as lesser, and I think that's part of the problem, right? Like it assumes that people can't know as much or can't be as good critical thinkers because they went to trade school instead of getting a liberal arts degree. And that's part of the false structuralism of what higher education is. It has sold itself as something that it is not, or at least comes with these trappings that I don't think quite capture what we're actually trying to do.
Right, right. As you're talking, at a bunch of different ideas sort of, ricocheting around my head and trying to remember what they all were now. But yeah, I mean, I think along with that, like, it was basically like, are you a college bound student? And that goes all the way back down through K through 12. You're treated very differently if you're a college bound student than if you are a tech school, or if you're just like a dropout or whatever. I will say, as a dad of two sons who are now 13 and 16, the thing that I would say comes across from day one of kindergarten is pressure to perform, right? And it's like, why are we giving our 7-year-olds, 6-year-olds anxiety about school, right? Like, and I think, I mean, again, I would say this is more of a reach, but in my mind, capitalism is one thing, and then having capitalism as your organizational ideology for your culture is another. And I think that's the problem, is we've got the latter, in which it is trying to be applied to absolutely everything, and it's not welcome, and it does not work well, right? But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, parents are stressed, overworked, and they look at their kids and they're like, why aren't you stressed and overworked? Right? Like, you're never going to get anywhere in life if you don't learn how to work hard. And it's like, well, actually, they'll learn more through play. You know what I mean? And like, through projects and through making stuff. Leave the metrics and the actuarial science till you're an adult. And K through 12 should be much more about free form, learning about lots of different, and what I'm basically getting around to is, we have MOOCs, we have these other free Khan Academy, right, that are free online things, and universities are really keen on MOOCs. But if you don't know what is it, massive online open course? Yeah, open course, where anybody basically for free can register and take a class on French Revolution or whatever, right? Well, the completion of those is pretty low, because there's no feedback, because there's no mechanism for anybody to give the feedback, right? There's no way to personalize any of that. So MOOCs kind of went down the can, into the can, because it's like, oh, well, this, and again, it's not because it was a bad idea or whatever, it's because it wasn't going to make anybody any money, or not enough money to make it worthwhile, right? But, I'm just thinking, if you create a K through 12 system in which the initial experience from K through whatever, as you go up, is wonder, is ideas, creativity, innovate, like all these things that people actually throw around, but then they want to measure the fucking things, right? It's like, what percentage creativity was this versus, intellectual thinking or whatever? It's like, you're missing the whole point. If you build a rubric, or if you build some sort of like a metric for all of these things, it's not going to work consistently. So either you standardize everything and then just hope for the best, which is what we've chosen, or you get rid of the fucking metrics, right? And
well, I think this is like actually a good synthesis of like all of the bullet points we included in the epilogue. This idea that if you really want this stuff to work, right now, the best we can do is, as individual educators, adopt strategies working within a system that we know is failing on a large scale, but that we can control in our micro scale. So I can't control what the university is doing. I can't control how it's organizing itself. I can't control its priorities. But in my specific classroom, I shouldn't even just say at the university. This would be true at a corporation as well, or in K-12. But I can control this small piece of it. So I'm going to do the things that I know will work, that I know will give these students an opportunity to explore their creativity, their critical thinking, their empathy. In light of that, I think the only alternative is to essentially say, these systems are too big, too broken, invested in all the wrong things. We just kind of have to wait for them to collapse under their own weight. And in the interim, try to find ways to, within our smaller community, bring out some of these other values. Now, that can be in various capacities. You and I have talked at length about what we think our job in terms of taking action looks like. We've spent the whole book and the whole podcast talking about people taking action. Well, as you articulated earlier, we only come into contact with a small number of learners, and of those, we have no idea how many are going to go out into the quote unquote real world and utilize this stuff in the way that we hoped. But what we can do is empower other educators to use tools like world modeling, like simulation, like play, to tackle wicked problems, to get your learners to understand that things are complex and get them to grapple with that complexity so that they will be more comfortable doing so in the future. And the institution of higher ed, the institution of K-12 education, the institution of the way industry trains, that part's probably never going to change because of this. But we can at least empower a larger number of individual educators to do this
Yeah,
stuff and
absolutely.
make hopefully some impact on the broader ecosystem, and hope that down the road that those learners across distributed across all of these different educators will ultimately go out and do things that do move the ball in a new direction.
Yeah, yeah. Growing up, in the United States, growing up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, right, post-war United States, the theme of wealth and we're expanding this economy, and all these kind of things. And it's like, oh, well, I, as an individual, have the capacity to do whatever I put my mind to, right? Is what is baked in at a deep level. And it's something that I think that's like part of the reputation of the United States, is the United States is able to do incredible things because people don't see limits, right? They just see, like, if it's there, I can get there. But that's also like, okay, well, ask every person who has moved out to Hollywood who wanted to be an actor. Well, how many times did that dream come true? It's like lottery ticket kind of, winning or whatever. And I think instead of feeling like an abject failure and being like, I never achieved what I was supposed to achieve because I was supposed to be the next Meryl Streep or whatever, right? It didn't happen. It's like, well, maybe that wasn't really all that accurate. That one person, when put in the right place and time with all of the different kinds of forces that are happening, there are times in which people can step up to the plate and be the one, right? Be the person who's making things happen. But for just logically, most of us are not going to be that one person, but that doesn't mean that our lives are then meaningless, right? So it's like, okay, well, what can you do when you wake up in the morning and go to bed at night? What are the things that you can do in your own life that would maybe do some sort of drop in the bucket of help? Right? That is good, that you have full control over, right? I mean, not full, but you've got a pretty good handle on. And I think that that's where, for me, seeing those, like any teacher, seeing them actually start to piece concepts together, right? And this is like when we were talking about the assessment part and the critical reflections, having them come up with reflections that you hadn't intended, but are like 100% on the money. I think I'd said this earlier, that one of my favorite student critical reflections with the world building with the 14 substructural categories. And one of the things that she wrote was, now I realize the reason why it's so hard to do social change is you can't just change one. Changing one is going to ripple throughout all 14, right? And I'm like, that's nothing that I've ever articulated in that way. And it's exactly correct. Like, I wish I had articulated it that way. That's like a great blurb for the whole thing. But that's why I do it, and that's why I'm in it, and that's where too. It's just one of those things that for me, that when I was talking before about that tipping point of when does it stop being enough, or when does it stop being, this is no longer something that I want to do. Like, that is really like, if the teaching gets to the point where it's scaled up beyond me being able to have personal relationships with any of my students ever, because right now I generally teach one big class, and then my other classes are around 20 students, right? So at least in the big class, I just sort of accept I'm not going to get to know those students. If it changes, in which I never have the experience of teaching a small class again and getting to know those students, then my interest in teaching really drops a lot, right? Because even all the stuff that we're talking about, it's harder to do at scale. It's not impossible to do at scale. There's a lot of good stuff to do at scale, and the reflections and all that kind of stuff still works. But for the instructor, I think there's less satisfaction, maybe, or maybe you get satisfaction from like then working with each individual, table of groups or whatever, whatever it is. But yeah, it's just one
I
of those
do think that's it. I mean, it's got to be we actually didn't talk much about this specifically, but when I would do role-playing activities with my students, I would either have them role play individually, so each person played their own character, or I would have a group that would play one character. And I think in a large setting like a lecture, you would have to be okay with developing the personal relationships with the TAs who would be doing this, right? Like that, it just changes the scale, the order of magnitude of the scale, right? And my fear, and the thing that I've seen happening, is like, we're just also not going to give you TAs. So now you're responsible for 130, 150 people, but no TAs to help you grade or anything. And then at that point, you really are just, trying to do the best that you can to keep your head above water. And this goes back to the resourcing issue. Like, if you want this stuff to work, you have to put the resources behind it. And if administrators are not willing or able to do that,
behind the right stuff, right? I mean, there's plenty,
yes.
There's plenty of money flowing into higher ed. It's just not going to the right stuff.
Yeah, well, and echoing what we've said previously, it's very easy and quick to buy iPads. It's very easy and quick to buy smart boards. It's very
Yep.
easy and quick to get a computer, a Chromebook, or whatever for every student. It is a lot harder, and you're never going to be able to prove, quote unquote, the return on investment of spending money to teach your educators about
Yeah.
inquiry-based learning and about
Right.
world
Right.
building and about
Yep.
constructionism. And I think
Yep.
this was something I was going to say earlier, but the Adventures of Jasper Woodbury end up being a really good metaphor here too, as we're talking about sort of what works and doesn't about education as a whole. Jasper was created by John Bransford and his team at Vanderbilt for the purposes of extending the conversation about language arts and math content for middle schoolers. So if you wanted them to really engage with a problem and think about all the potentialities that could stem from that, all the downstream effects, all the potential ill-defined answers that you could give, that takes time. And
Yep.
what ended up happening is the further they got removed from the implementation, the more that people tried to package it, the more that they wanted it to be turnkey,
Yeah.
the more it turned into a word problem that was used as a summative assessment and no longer had the
Yeah.
instructional utility that
Right.
it did when
Right.
they started the process.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we're seeing here is the distillation of a big idea that is useful in a qualitative sense that works for all of these different kinds of environments and students and is flexible. The more you try to package it to be turnkey, the more it becomes a word problem, the more it
Yeah.
becomes a
Exactly.
summative assessment, the more
Yep.
it becomes something that is, packaged and sellable, and it is not actually the thing we're talking about because you can't sell a pro-social constructionist
Yep.
inquiry driven
Yep.
teaching process. That's just
Yep.
not,
Yep. Yep.
it's not how it works.
I'm thinking now too, what we need to, so we're talking about, this is the last sort of chapter. We're going to do some case studies. And then, we're talking about continuing doing the podcast. And I think one of the main ways that we could sort of showcase this mentality is the response to COVID-19, right? Where it's like, at the end of the day, what, and this is in my hindsight is also 2020 here. What they should have spent tons and tons and tons of money doing was hiring anybody who was anywhere who had any background in education to help support students who are currently in school, right? To meet with them online, to reduce the instructor to student ratio or whatever. But what did they do? They bought plexiglass, right? They used all of these ineffective means because they needed to get students back on campus. Why do they need to get students back on campus? For their room and board and their food, right? And it's like, that's it's just one of those things that it's really just kind of dispiriting where it's like, oh, this isn't about the education then, is it? Right. And this is where I'm hoping I'm not going to get fired for all of these comments. But I think it's also like, oh, that's the way that universities responded. University presidents get on these national conference calls and they all just kind of do the same thing. So it's like, we're all going to do the same thing and therefore we're all going to get the same result. And it's very
There's risk aversion built in, right? Like it is intended to be that way. And actually, now that you're mentioning it, I think obviously there's not enough time to do that here, but I would love to at some point in the future do an entire discussion just about what does this look like if you do it for a fully online environment versus a face-to-face one. Like there's some really interesting stuff here because as you were talking about COVID specifically, I started to think like that was my biggest complaint when everything went online is that we didn't spend any time or energy doing professional development for educators about how to teach online. Like that, my colleague Mike Young and I were very lucky that we had been working in almost exclusively online educational spaces for years before that happened because we just flipped the switch and it was like, okay, well, first of all, nothing changes for most of our students, at least not with respect to our interactions with them or the way that we're teaching them. But also now we can spend some time helping our colleagues understand how to do this stuff. Unfortunately, there was never time or money dedicated or allocated for that. And I think if you want to build a really effective world building course for a fully online environment, it's possible. I've done it. It's just a question of where do you draw some of the lines between what you would do face to face versus online. So anyway, the reason I mentioned that is just like that's another one of those conversations I'd love to have down the road about what would good online world building look like.
And then synchronous versus asynchronous or combinations, all that stuff would be great. Yeah, it would be good to talk about. So what are your concluding thoughts about all this stuff?
I stand by the fact
for academic jargon.
Stuff.
Stuff.
I stand by the fact that I really do think in going back through the book and thinking about why we wrote what we did, what we included, what we cut, that we ended up making a product that I'm pretty proud of. Like I actually think it's approachable. I think it communicates the things we wanted it to. And hopefully you listeners agree and are going to try to implement some of this stuff. I think that book that we wrote is the kind of book I wanted when I was going through
Right.
an education program, right?
Yeah,
Like I needed
absolutely.
somebody to just explain like how could these things come together and work because just like all of the disciplinary silos that you experience in undergrad, when you go through a teacher ed program, it's still siloed. You're still getting
Yeah.
your learning theory course and your pedagogy course and your reading course or literacy course. And there really isn't a lot of effort spent trying to integrate or synthesize all of those disparate aspects of what it is to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And I really, really want people to walk away from the experience of reading this book and listening to this podcast, seeing the places where this stuff comes together, and then thinking about how can I implement this with my own spin on it? How can I take my own life world and do something with it? So
Right.
that's my final thought is this is your thing now.
Yep.
It is
Yep.
out of our hands, and what you do with it is up to you, but that's the point. I want people to do cool, interesting things with this template. And please, by all means, if you ever have thoughts or questions or comments, let us know because we are here to support that implementation. We want this to be something that is adopted by as many educators as possible. And we kind of look forward to hearing from people what's worked for them that we never would have thought of doing ourselves.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is my sort of like, I don't know why I keep coming back to cherry on the cake. It must be because my kid was making cupcakes yesterday. But anyway, what I would say too is that, I started doing this stuff and then started sharing it at conferences. Steve, you started doing this stuff and I learned a lot from what you were doing and the way that I was doing it. And I think it was sometime when you or I was defending our dissertation and we had this question of like, well, what is it like collaboratively written, collaboratively, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's like everything is just such an intense collaboration. You owe so much to when you're doing the kind of research that we do, you owe so much to your students, you owe so much to your colleagues, owe so much to your mentors. It doesn't feel like your dissertation is even yours. It feels like it's a collaborative kind of effort, right? And writing this book, it was, and we saying mutual love society or whatever, mutual respect society, that it was so much better working with you than just solo writing this. And I keep thinking, gee, I want to have a conversation with people who listen to this and see what they have to say, right? So whenever you're listening to this, it's been some of the things that we say may not have aged. Current events or things like that may not be quite, I'm sure there's going to be other horrific things that are happening in 2026. Let's all have this conversation. And the other thing too that I was thinking is as we were talking and we never quite know, we spend about 5 minutes reading the chapter and then being like, what are we going to talk about? And there's all these anecdotal references and things like that. And I'm serious. I want to go back and try and find and acknowledge if I can't find, at least say, well, maybe I made this up or maybe it came to me in a dream because I can't find any resources on it, right, or whatever. But also being like corrected. And if I've said something that I'm like, actually, that's not true. That's factually not true. Then like, my God, email and like maybe we could be on the show to correct it, right? This is where being open, and we've talked about this too, and maybe this is where I'll leave it, is that we've gotten, at least in the United States, into this place where it seems like people are so terrified of not even being wrong, of not knowing something, that they don't ever want to admit that they don't know something. And it's like, there is more that you don't know than there is you will ever know, right? And it's like, it's just a natural thing that people, I would like to see a world going way back to sort of the K through 12 stuff. If we could culturally develop an attitude towards lifelong learning, kindergarten is the first step in the rest of your life, not through the end of college, to continue to be learning and thinking and reassessing, and all this kind of thing. So I mean, that's just what I would sort of say is like, that's the kind of conversation that in my mind, who knows what the reach of this will actually be, who knows how many people will actually sort of communicate. But at this point, it's the best I got. You know what I mean? That's the best hope that I have, is having interesting conversations with smart people from different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, people who are of different races, different gender identities, different sexual orientations, different parts of the world, speaking different languages, right? Different cultures, all those kind of things. Like, bring it, because I think both you and I are like, okay, well, let's fold this in to our understanding of world building, of simulations, of play. Let's fold it into our own personal experiences and become richer, better people for it. And then let's monetize the fuck out of it.
That's my takeaway from the last 16 of these is monetize the fuck out of it.
This was always only for the money. This free podcast was only for the money. So buy the book for all your friends, and I guess that's
tell them about it. It'll be it's available through MIT Press. We will have an audiobook available as well.
Yep.
And we look forward to hearing from all of you. But thank you for listening thus far. And we hope you'll continue listening as we move into the case studies and our interviews with various scholars who do this kind of work. I really do think those conversations will be valuable. And do let us know what you think.
All right. Thanks, Steve. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to doing this more because it's now become a sort of a hobby or a cottage industry.
Staple part of the diet.
Staple part of my diet. Yeah. All right, dude.
All right. Thanks very much.
Yep. Bye.
The Worldbuilding Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The Worldbuilding Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.